Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the next deep dive, which is the CDA. And I'll also talk a bit about the NSC to have like a bit of context about Dutch politics. So, what am I going to talk about? Now, I'm just going to keep it relatively simple today. I'm just going to talk only about the politics of the CDA and a bit about how it's really done in the recent elections. And I'm going to talk about the NSC, or the new social contract, splitting off from the CDA to kind of like give you an idea of how splitting off as a party could kind of like work for the Netherlands. I got like you have a president that you could refer to in debates. So let's just start with the CDA. What's the CDA? So the CDA is the Christian Democratic Appeal. Nice translation. It keeps the same letters. And this is Henry Bontebal, who is the main leader of the party. As you can see, they are center right, and they are more center than right, and they're also quite center when it comes to progressive and conservatism. So what are the things then that they stand for? So the general platform is they are a Christian party, which means they do really care about religious freedom for specifically schools. And also things like euthanasia is always a bit complicated, where they currently do kind of allow it, and they're kind of like okay with the way the system is, but they are like against the general broadening of these kinds of things. In general, they're also, of course, like think it's like absolutely fine to be like gay and LGBT, and also in general are quite like maybe what some countries call progressive in form of like women's rights and that kind of stuff. Maybe on immigration also somewhat tighter. But that's kind of like why they are center, because they are still like maybe in some ways conservative, but they're still also progressive, still accepting in these kinds of ways. So a lot of the things that they focus on is like a decency politics, or the idea of kind of like solidarity. And the main idea is just that they kind of like think that people should be nice to each other and like should act normal, but not act normal in the way that VVD talks about it. Because VVD is more like normative, saying they should like follow the rules, kind of like have a specific idea of decency. Where here it's more specifically about forming a community and kind of like in that way. I don't want to say more empathetic as social to make it sound like it's really positive, but more in the form of you should be nice to each other, you should say hello to each other on the train, kind of stuff. Like it's what the things are they're talking about. They also have like an idea of a spread out responsibility. So the idea is just that you as an individual are kind of like responsible for yourself, but also you should be responsible for your community. That's why they are overall maybe more right leaning than center, or like more the center left. It's because they do also think that overall the state should be somewhat smaller, like I give more freedom to these individuals, but there are kind of like specific norms and expectations that they have. Same idea also for like climate change, where because they think that God has given us this earth, we like need to look over it. Kind of like, yeah, we should make sure that we have like green policies, and we should have make sure we don't have too many CO2 emissions and like nitrogen, but they're also not very much something that will like push for this really, really hard. It's not something that they would propose of like really like strong or like maybe radical changes for the environment. It's more of a thing where they can kind of like argue that this is a good thing within their own standpoints. Like I said, there's also kind of like center right, and they used to be particularly big in the rural areas. If you also see the previous video I did about the geography of the Netherlands, you also actually see more where they were quite big. It's been basically taken over by other parties. One of them being the PVV, very tight anti-immigration policies. Also the BBB, which is the Farmers Party, who now has suddenly decreased a lot. The Farmers Party and also the PVV a bit. And now, basically, CDA has gotten more of that rural backing back, but still kind of like questionable to what extent they're able to cater to these specific individuals. Like, it's still definitely within the debate. Then, where did they go for last elections? So, important context to know is that they came from like opposition parts. So they were not part of the previous coalition, and they were in a historically low position. So if you also see again the other video, you can see that the CDA has got a lot of votes, and of like been a major party, has been a lot of coalitions in the past, but now they only had like 5 seats, which is very, very low. The main thing that they now came from is the idea of that, well, we had so much chaos in the last coalition, and there's a lot of like policies were implemented, a lot of people wouldn't trust the government. Kind of like now it's just back to business, kind of like sober, normal, that kind of stuff. In a way, you can maybe compare this to Joe Biden running more of a sober campaign after like Trump and kind of like the MK. We've all had this crazy time now. We're sick of that. We just want to get policies through and just get things done. Um, yeah, so that's kind of like where they come from. Also, a very interesting discussion to think is that if you, for example, would have um, like I said in the first video, you have a minimum required for the amount of seats a party would have. I said that, for example, 7 or 8, which would be oftentimes done. This would mean that if that would have been set in the past, the CDA would have suddenly just not been in parliament, which would be like a really big shock, because that would be very hard trying to get funding, very hard to get like campaigning money and that kind of stuff. So it's a very interesting context coming from this if you also want to think about that specific motion. So what else do you then have that they focus on? So I had to look back what specifically the CDA stand for, because even though I did read all the campaign and like I did watch a lot of like talk shows, a lot of it was more about the individual and kind of like the ideas that like sober, back to business, all this kind of stuff. Which kind of like shows you also maybe kind of like why there wasn't maybe as strong of a push for any specific policies, but they're just a spread out back to normal business. So things that they're just having like, okay, we need to build houses, we need to solve the housing crisis, all this kind of stuff. They are center right, so they still talk about helping the economy, specifically family businesses. They have specific policies there. It's still kind of like getting a grip on immigration, and just like the VVD, they didn't really focus as much on it. Like it wasn't like a vocal point of it, but they are still trying to like appease like people who are more maybe right wing, who want to more conservative, want to like have less of this immigration, and therefore want to have this policy be implemented, but not super duper like strong on it. Also, like I said, they're relatively green. Like they can implement a lot of like green policies in the platform, and they had some ideas. But they even when they were in parliament, they've been pushing things. It hasn't been like very active, and there's quite some criticism to what extent they truly were implementing like green policies and like things that were good for the environment when they were in power. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of like also showing the flexibility that the CDA has as a center party, which kind of like is interesting to know for like framing where again this is a coalition country, you need form coalitions. So why this party might be this way because it's very big, maybe a specific context like values that they have, and you can then frame what this does for policies and all these kind of things. Which is why I'm talking to you about this. So now what is the actual results? So during the election cycle, so before we actually all voted, actually CDA was doing really, really well, and in the polls it showed that they were possibly going to be the prime minister. Um, in the end, that didn't happen because they were the fifth biggest party after the election. And the question is like, why is that the case? It's kind of like complex, and I can give you a couple of possible answers. The first one is maybe the others just campaigned a bit better. E.g., as we'll talk about D66, also had a more positive, optimistic view of kind of like getting policies done, but also had maybe a bit more grabbing policies. Like I said, I had to look up what exactly was again the policies the CDA actually stand for. Some of them are very specific, but oftentimes more of the vibe and kind of like getting things done, like hardline that they voted that they kind of like uh, focused on during the election cycle. The second thing is if you see one of the parties becomes really, really big, you might get tactical voting. So, for example, let's say you are somewhat more right wing. You feel like, okay, the CDA is going to be really, really big. What I want more right wing policies. Since they might work together with both like Labour or potentially the right, I'll try to vote for a more right wing party, like the VVD. And then this will mean that we got more right wing policy. Or like when they form a coalition, they're more likely to go that way. All these kinds of things. That might also kind of like deter people from voting it. And also, thirdly, there was a specific kind of like controversy which kind of like was played in. So because it is Christian and they have kind of like a Christian background and like a Christian community dedicated to, there was at some point a news documentary that became big and it was about like why you still have in the Bible Belt and conservative areas, you have schools where they said that it was okay to be gay, but you can't act gay in these reformist schools. And basically what the CDA standpoint was, and kind of like had to be was, well, we don't want to restrict this religious freedom because our backing kind of doesn't want it, but also still you want to kind of like you don't want to be too conservative, seen as too radical, because like saying that this is okay and that kind of stuff also isn't something you want to do. So basically, it had to walk a very tight line. Where on the one hand they said like, look, I personally think this person should be able to act all this kind of stuff, and then says, but we would lose a lot of like beauty about Netherlands Dutch tolerance, like our culture, if we would make these schools more like restrictive and we wouldn't allow this kind of freedom and that kind of stuff. And it kind of like became a kind of like a wishy-washy kind of answer, which in the end says, I don't agree with these politics, but I'm not going to change anything. And then other parties also kind of like played hard on this. So the VVD and talk shows kind of like attacked the CDA for this, saying like, I'm kind of really shocked about this because we're tolerant, we should accept these people, and they should not hear this in these schools, all that kind of stuff. That also could potentially be a reason why maybe some more center voters were turned off and thought it was maybe too Christian, maybe too conservative in its ways, and then went specifically to D66, which became really, really big. These are potential ways to kind of like show why the results happened. And that kind of stuff. So now, as some of you might have seen from my other workshop on Dutch politics that I've given a while ago, there's also a different party, which is NSC, which is the new social contract, where you have Pieter Omtzigt and you have Nicole van Vroonhoven. So I'm just going to give you a bit of context about this because this is really important to see how parties split off and why it might be good, why it might be bad, and what this actually does for politics. So basically, Pieter Omtzigt used to be part of the CDA. Then there basically some kerfuffle going on. They split off, started their own party, became really big, was part of the previous coalition, and then now they have 0 seats in parliament. So how did they get formed? So I'm not going to go into detail, but the idea was just there was a child benefits affair where basically families were unfairly like punished or like detected as fraud. Then Peter Omtzigt really went into a lot of like detail about this and was really pushing back on this. And the CDA, like top of the party, just didn't really want this because it was too much like critical also against the CDA. And basically at that point they just split off. The leader originally was Peter Omtzigt, but in the last coalition, he had to step down because he got a burnout, which happened before as well when he was split off from some party. Or like when he was his own party, like so when he was still with the CDA, he still had like an issue with burnout. That kind of like took like a space back, and now here same thing happened, and then basically Nicole van Fraunhofer took over. Then there was just until the election, and then the new elections happened, and then they went for another third person, which is Eddie van Heim. So the platform is very similar to the CDA because there's just a lot of like CDA like people. The spin off was from the CDA, and Omtzigt does was really caring for the party as well. So a lot of the things were like decency politics, like also was there, but now specifically was about changing the political culture. So just saying that the way that we have a lot of these rules in the Netherlands, the way that we are just very, very strict, we can't criticize things that go wrong. All of this means that in the end, this is going to be very bad for people on the ground. And that's really what they focus on. And a lot of the charisma of this party came from the fact that they did have like Peter Omtzigt. I misspelled the name here, but Peter Omtzigt being someone like a file stack, like really digging deep into the files, doing research, like kind of like going for policies, calling things out, and just having that like a front man being the thing that you're really behind. The policies platform itself is just a lot like the CA, so like housing is the same. They had like in the new election, they also talked about welfare, having a good pension, making sure that when you try to get benefits, it's accessible, all this kind of stuff, and also somewhat tight migration policies. Where the focus of them is really we need to make sure this happens in a democratic way, and this happens in a way that is overall quite good, and right according to the law. So it's a lot like CDA in the sense it is just more now just we need to change the political culture. So then why did they go to 0 seats recently? So I think the reason is just there's a lot of reasons. One, in the coalition, they weren't really able to push policies through. Like they wanted to have a migration policy. The migration policy was basically struck down because it wasn't really satisfying. The laws wasn't being effective, which basically meant that the thing they went for just was not something they pushed for, and also because they were a relatively they weren't the biggest party in the coalition. They also weren't able to push a lot of the policy through. They were able to give a couple of ministers, but that was about it. Secondly, also they kind of like lost their leader. So Omtzigt stepped down, and then Van Fraunhofer came up there. Like I've like took over the job. There's criticisms and also positives about her work. So she did allow, for example, a lot of research and like of like files to be opened up about the coalition on the principle of democracy, like the principles of like what is good governance and like how politicians should act, which you could say is consistent with the kind of like policy that you go for, which is changing the political culture. But then the opposite also is true, which is kind of like you are harming your own party in this because you're also showing like the weaknesses that are happening within the coalition talks. And overall, like I said, it was relatively like it wasn't like as strong of a message that they were able to get. And therefore, because of that, they weren't really effective. And also, like Van Fraunhofer, even if she took over as a job, would be really able to galvanize of the people who voted for them previously to get new votes. And then they went for Eddie van Heij, who's even like a third person we haven't heard of. And when again you have a lot of other parties that you do see on the news, like the VVD, the PVV, like Labour, and like you have a new person you haven't seen, like you kind of like get drowned out. And he didn't have any specific or unique charisma or skills or things that it would like stand out from the crowd. So I think also just the lack of leadership, like of like continuation or at least interestingness from the leader also did harm their platform, and therefore that's why they got their seats. And lastly, there's also like internal fighting. So there was like disagreement about how policies were handled. There was disagreement about opening up the kind of like the showing the documents about what happened during the coalition talks, all this kind of stuff, and giving them give the opposition parties and the second chamber access to these kind of things. Where some said it was good, some said it's bad, and because of the internal infighting, it also just seemed unstable. So like if you want to change like the political culture, the youth party is divided, and you also yourself have done things that might harm that principle because you're going too hard for it, or you just are inexperienced, and that inexperience shows in the way that you have created policy and still went to the coalition, and were unable to really get out of it in a good way. Got like the party got like died out as a consequence of this. So what's then the conclusion of this? So the CDA currently is the only party standing of the two. They are the smallest party in the minority coalition that currently exists. So that's with the VVD and D66. There is like a showing of like why campaigning was effective and ineffective, and also what kind of like explains what splitting off as a party might do. So this is a cautionary tale for new parties when they become like they're very big things they disagree with, like why they might be effective, why they might be ineffective, why it might be good for them to be in coalitions, why they might not be good in coalitions, why they might make those choices, all of this kind of stuff. So now I have a bit more context about how this actually looks like in the Netherlands. I hope this is clear. If you have any questions, again, just put them in the comments or contact me directly, and then see you in the next video. Cheers.